And those of you who are listening here, I have a tip from the Passable folks that it might be better if you are all watching in theater mode. You should see that as one of the options below on your Passable window. But if you click theater mode, you should be able to see speakers as well as slides rather than just one or the other. I think those are the only housekeeping details I have. So let's start. Ron, thank you for sharing with us.
Yes, is my good morning. So everyone, thank you for allowing me to speak today. I also have Michaela Duquesne, our GIS inventory forester, on as well. She can introduce herself, but thank you. Is my screen sharing and you can hear me and everything's all good? All right. So yeah, so I'm Ron Waukau, Interim Forest Manager at Menominee Tribal Enterprises. I've worked on the forest for many years in different aspects, fire included. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about fire management and history. Kaylee?
Hi, as Ron said, I'm the GIS and Inventory Forester here with Menominee Tribal Enterprises Forestry Department. I just kind of keep count of the trees on the forest, more or less. I'm also Ron's right-hand person, so we do work a lot together. He'll mostly be running the presentation, but if I think he misses anything, you'll hear me chime in. So take it away, Ron.
All right. Okay. So we were asked about the picture here. This is a picture on the forest. It was a burn that we did, maybe 10 years ago, of a white pine shelterwood burn. The DNR was monitoring in their patrols, and they saw the smoke. They came over, asked them to take a picture, asked the pilot on the radio if he could email it to me, and so I have some pretty nice aerial pictures of some of our burns from the state. So hold on. I'm already having technical difficulties here. There we go. Can you see that? Just a little history of our location, if people are not familiar with our location, north central Wisconsin. Completely 220,000 acres and then we're 90% forested, so we have a large tract of timber. We're trying to bring fire back onto the forest. There's our original land that Menominee occupied, and each color quoted indication on the map area is a different treaty, and we eventually ended up on the square that you're seeing in 1854. So the history is, add a little disclaimer, it's a history of fire that we've found through old documents, pictures, photos, maps. It's not the oral history of fire that we share, but it's just what we could find documented. I do add the fire, the oral history of fire, origins of fire story that I could find, the one I could find in this old Walter J. Hoffman book from 1890 that talks about how Menominee, the fire originated. So I think that's important, and that's what we kind of try to stress to when we do outreach to our younger tribal students and some other tribal members. When we do outreach, is that we talk about the cultural significance of that fire had and the importance of it to the tribe. It was a very important tool, that they use. So we try to keep that message going as much as we can whenever we go out and do some outreach. The other pretty important notes that we discovered were the General Land Office survey notes that were done from 1833 to 1866 across the whole state, including on the Menominee Forest. So it's a picture of the vegetation in Wisconsin, and between 1830s and 1860s. So drastic changes now, but it's another snapshot to show us how much, just actually how much fire was burning across the Wisconsin during that time. Actual notes from the forest. These are all online. Actual notes that show, if you look on the right side of the notes, 5.00, it says entered burn lands. That's an actual transect going through the forest. And at 442.00 leave burn land. So it's showing just kind of where the fires were. So we can look at that and get an actual location of those coordinates, or the township and range, and we can look at that now and see what kind of timber type we have there. We roughed together from those notes a 1830s pre-settlement forest cover, kind of a rough GIS map of our forest. A lot of open, what we would consider brush. So the whole eastern half of the reservation was much more open, which was being burned, and the northwest part was much more sugar maple and northern hardwood types. Just some historic pictures we throw in to show the openness of an old settlement. This is more like the early 1900s of the open, and the farming was still family farms to sustain people were still going. This is basically a pine. These were the bigger fires we were having in the early 1900s logging camp era. You can see the burned over stands, and then the bit pine stumps out in the burn. So now this is predominantly aspen, white birch, growing back in the central part of our forest, where these bigger, hotter slash fires were taking place in the early 1900s. Listen to the keynote speaker this morning talk about the nomadic people, and I thought about this vegetation of Wisconsin. I don't know if anyone has read the John T. Curtis book, but he talks about the nomadic hunting tribes throughout the state, and means man-made features were not. I got Joe's talking on the phone next to me. Hold on. Post-glacial period mean how much burning was going on our forests, and how much of our ancestors that were doing that type of burning. This is another picture from the airplane along the Wolf River on our forest that, I think it just shows these types of fires and this vegetation were always burning across our lands traditionally. They were burning for all different types, berry production, keeping it clear, trails. So just a revenue. This comes out of the forests of the Menominee. It was a book that was written basically from 1854 to 1992 was a year. There was a lot of history in it, and it shows the revenue of the tribe. Comes right out of the book. Logs, maple sugar. This maple sugar production is amazing. The firs, and then obviously the blueberries was another staggering number of that many bushels collected. So, but again, I used the slide to show that the openness and the amount of fire that was occurring on the forest, if there was that much blueberry production going on. And then the bottom part of the bottom footnote is once that the Menominee became more of a forest dominated revenue generator, that these all kind of slid into more cultural significant activities. Another map, I always kind of use this map to show the eastern side of the forest was much more dry, open, scattered open pine. So in 1914 is the oldest planting map we could find in the forest. It shows young pine, scattered open pine. Blowdown is significant on the west side. That's actually created the sawmill. So this is a map that we use to show also just the openness and the amount of burning. Another historic picture. Shows a camp of Menominees camping basically in a berry patch. What caught my eye was the openness in the background. They had to be keeping it open. They had to know the fire. They had to know all of these, understood fire enough to be able to put fire down and go back and gather in these areas. Just some more, we're all forested now, just some more historic pictures of how open it was and how much fire we had historically on the forest. And talk about when we took fire off the landscape. Basically, reservation was formed 1854. Eliminating fire, kind of eliminated fire once the Menominees were put on the reservation 1854. They weren't able to do the type of burning that they were before. Some fire scar stuff we have shows each little mark on the line is a scar. It shows with the big campaigns that our fires really disappeared around the 1920s, 30s. This is what's happening on our forest. Pre-1900, we had a much more open landscape, a lot of fire, smoky bear, fire prevention, kind of closed it off, more shade tolerant. And that's kind of what we're facing now is much more cool, humid microclimates and mid-tolerant species growing in with the pine. This is a historic picture of pine on the left from late 1800s. Same area on the right, you can see without disturbance, without fire, without managing the pine, it's kind of transitioning into a northern hardwood stand. Southeast corner, again, this is from the fire tower, southeast corner of the reservation, much more open, like a pine barren. I'm sure the blueberries were dominant in there. So just another historic picture to show. And that's actually a fire. It kind of hazes out in the background. It's actually a picture of a fire burning over there somewhere. That's that same photo today. Looking southeast, you can see the oak, the pin oak, and the rest of the trees filled in, and a lot of red maple and stuff in there. So I'll end it. I like this quote from the Salish Kootenai tribe. We're just here doing our part and putting fire back on the land as much as we can, and learning from the past, putting it back on land for us, and hopefully we can set it up and for our children, and they can continue to manage the resource in a way that's beneficial, and they use fire when they do it. So that's my presentation. Kind of ripped through it pretty fast, but
thanks a lot, Ron. McKaylee,
Yep.
If you have anything you'd like to add, we've got a minute or two, or if anyone would like to ask Ron and McKaylee a question, you can take yourself off mute and speak up, or you can type into the chat screen. That's right, Melanie. Ron was ripping.
yeah.
We have a comment in here that Ron was ripping through it just like a wildfire.
Yeah, that's good. Yep.
Ron, this is Adrian Layton, actually on the at Salish Kootenai College here at CSKT. I got a question about when you showed the satellite photo there, going through the northwest corner, there was that line. Is that the old tornado scar?
That is correct. Go ahead, Adrian.
Has fire been part of cleaning that up too, or have you been able to? What have you been doing?
Yes, yeah. That was a good question. That is, you could see the scar. That was from the 2007 tornado that went across that northwest part of the reservation. And yes, we just did a burn 2 weeks ago. We just did a burn in that prescribed fire in that natural disturbance area. So we're going to try and keep at least a couple of 100 acres in there of natural early successional. We're just going to, we're calling it a wildlife right now, a wildlife opening, but we're going to keep fire in there in that natural disturbance area. So that's our plans. We might even add more to it, but yep, that was correct. That was a tornado, and we are burning in it. So
sharp eyes. We have one more question for you, Ron, before we switch speakers. We'll we'll take other questions at the end. So I'm not trying to cut off discussion here, but Melanie asks, Ron, can you talk about the little blue butterfly you all helped through burning?
Yeah, we are. I didn't add any of those slides, but we do have ecological restoration burns that we've been doing in the southeast corner, strictly for the corner blue butterfly. We're trying to increase and build a habitat. Again, we're taking stands that are predominantly pin oak. We're kind of leaving the pine, and then we're putting. We have a fuels crew, very active fuels crew that's able to come in behind us, clean those areas up, and we're able to put fire back down. So we are restoring acres for the corner blue as well.
All right, maybe one more topic we can circle back around to at the end. Thanks, Melanie. And thank you, Ron.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and switch to our next speaker. And the lineup here is Evan Larson from UW Platteville. Evan, can you, yes, it looks like you grabbed the reins already. Perfect.
We good? This is showing up. I don't have a little green box around my screen. Can you see my my presentation?
Yes,
right.
I'm seeing your landing screen there.
All right, wonderful. Well, bonjour, poso. Hello. My name is Evan Larson. My ancestors are from Scandinavia and Germany and Italy. And I grew up on land just south of Mille Lacs Lake in central Minnesota, where my parents have been working about 45 years now, tending what was abused grazing lands into a forest. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk and the Fox, the Sauk, and the Squawky, Potawatomi, Miami, in an area that's called the Driftless area down in southwest Wisconsin. It's named that way because of its unique geologic history. And I think what is it also carries an amazing cultural history. It's been a crossroads for a long time, ever since the ice that surrounded this has melted. And so there have been so many people and cultures that have lived here and been supported by this land. So I feel like that's a really appropriate place to be talking about something like fire. I want to say thanks for organizing and just acknowledge that I'm really honored to share space with all of you and with so many good people doing so much important work. It's really great to be here, and thanks for all for being here. So I'm coming to you today as a translator. And the knowledge that I want to share with you today is knowledge that I've learned from trees. And they are my teachers. And as a theme of reciprocity, I feel is probably going to be woven throughout this conference. I want to say that in thanks for what I've learned, I'm offering up this story in this context with the hope that the information that we share here and talk about helps to build and heal relationships that in a lot of places have been diminished or broken because of centuries of colonization. And so so for that, I'm grateful to the trees, and that I hope that I can honor what I've learned. I feel like this panel is also about healing, and that Ishkude fire is a really central process to that. So I am a dendrochronologist. I use tree rings to reconstruct past environments. And for about the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of work up in northern Minnesota in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. It's right on the border between Minnesota and Ontario, US and Canada, just south of Quetico Provincial Park, and just to the east of Voyageurs National Park. It is a federal wilderness area. And what drew us to this place was at first an academic question, a critique of Western concepts of wilderness. And this project quickly transformed into a life-defining effort. And so I really appreciate having an opportunity to share some of that. One of the really special parts about the Boundary Waters today is that because you travel by canoe, you engage with the landscape in a way that's similar to how people have traveled this landscape for centuries and millennia. And you see this, it helps you slow down and see the land differently than you would traveling by motorboat or car. It's easy in this time to kind of feel this piece and to understand the origins of some of the ideas that protected this area as a federal wilderness area in 1964, but that key line that this is an area where the earth and community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain, is something that's woven throughout a lot of society and culture, and that's a really key idea. And so that's what kind of drew us to this point. Standing is Lane Johnson. This is when he was just starting his master's thesis work at the University of Minnesota with Dr. Kurt Kiffmueller, who's kneeling in the foreground, who is also my PhD advisor. Lane was an archaeologist with the U.S. National Forest, on Superior National Forest. And he proposed an idea to Kurt that he could use tree rings to identify the influence of people on the fire regimes of a few sites in the boundary waters, specifically on Lac LaCroix. The reason that this was important is that while sitting in this room, I think we can generally agree that humans and fire have had a long relationship in academic circles and in management circles. The extent to that relationship is debated a lot. And so Lane put together a really amazing thesis, produced some really interesting results, and we expanded that to a project that spanned the whole wilderness area. We were looking for trees like this. These are 300-plus-year-old red pine, and those scars at their base are fire scars. Triangular shape, you know that these trees have experienced at least 2 fires because the first fire scarred the tree and opened it. The second or later fire charred that scar face. And if you look more closely, you can start to see a really interesting record of fire, because in this landscape, a lot of people think about big stand replacing fires that rip through and restart succession from scratch every 50, 100, or 150 years. But this tree, looking at these fire scars, what you can see, as long as, whoa, no, my pen didn't quite catch. That's a fire scar. This is a fire scar. This is a fire scar here, 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 and here. And so here's a red pine on a tiny island in a big lake like Saginaw that's experienced 10 or more fires in its lifetime. That starts to tell you something about the fire regime at this site. When we found stumps like this, you can cut them, hand tools, because it's wilderness. The red pine is immensely resinous, and the wood is often really well preserved behind these scars. And if you polish up that surface and apply the process of cross-dating using growth rings and patterns in those rings to compare from this dead sample to living trees, you can assign absolute calendar dates to the rings of these trees. And in particular, every one of these little curling lobes that you see is where a fire burned by this tree and scarred it, but did not kill it. That's the fire history. That's the story this tree has to share. Began growing in 1679, it died in 1989. Fires were recorded in 1702, 1718, 1743, 1758, 1770, 1780, 1795, 1823, 1842, and 1850, at which point fire stopped striking this island because it's wilderness and it couldn't possibly have been people. Hardly untrammeled. While we were doing the work, we started encountering trees like this. This is a culturally modified tree. The bark was intentionally removed for a variety of purposes. One important one was to gather resin that would be used in the production of gum to patch birch bark canoes. If you look at the scar faces, you can see the marks that tools made when that bark was removed. In some cases, you can see scratches where the awls were used to harvest the resin that had hardened on that face. And if you find dead and down, we were able to sample these and date them just like those fire scars. And so we know with absolute certainty that it was in the spring of the year 1800 that the bark was peeled off of this pine. And what's really interesting here is you can see a fire scar in 1821 right after. At the same time we're looking at the fire scars and the peels, we looked at forest age structure. And so we inventoried the living trees that were at these sites, ran transects, collected increment core samples, and then used those cores to age the trees and relate the age of those trees to the history of land use and fire at these sites. And so the 30-second overview, this map shows everywhere that we went in Blue Lakes. Every red dot is where we found a fire scarred sample. Every larger circle is where we collected age structure data, and every yellow dot shows you where we encountered a culturally modified tree. That area indicated as the border route is one of the primary travel corridors for centuries, if not millennia, through this region. And one of the most profound realizations immediately is that close association of fire and peeled trees with the areas that people traveled most frequently. But there's also spots down in Cummings Lake in the southwest of this map that are off of that route. And so it's more complicated than that. For this talk, I'm going to focus on the data and the patterns that emerged. Every one of these gray lines represents a fire-scarred tree ring sample that we collected from a stump. The top cluster are from trees that were growing away from the border route. The bottom cluster is for trees that are growing on the border route. Every red dot represents where one of those trees recorded a fire event. And this graph shows you the cumulative number of fires that were recorded across the study area through time. This is going back 400, almost 500 years now. Here are the peel scars that we were able to sample and date. Similar thing, the blue dots now show you the date of peels. And if we overlay the cumulative count, you can see the very close association with the number of fire events. This is the patterns of tree establishment. And you can see this immense pulse of regeneration that very importantly started in the 1800s, not the 1900s. And this is also a time when fire was diminishing. This is before Smokey Bear. This is before fire suppression. If we throw on written records from European folks moving through the area, the Anishinaabe were documented at Crane Lake on the west side of this area, close after the transition of this lands from the Lakota to the Anishinaabe. You throw on the Nelson Act, which was intended to remove all off-reservation Ojibwe to the White Earth Reservation in Western North America. And the concept of wilderness is shattered in this location. That was one of the really important pieces of this work, is just to simply to set down old ideas that do not serve us well. Importantly, you can see that it's not just that fires stopped burning, but it's also that the forest started to change. And so if you look at these stands now, you have 250-year-old red pine. You have this dense thicket of pine surrounding them. Many of those trees are about 100 years old, and they started growing after the fires stopped. If you're in Western North America, you look at these and it's a ponderosa pine stand surrounded by ladder fuels. It's the same here in the Great Lakes. And what's really important here is this is not Smokey Bear necessarily. This is not fire suppression. This is a lack of ignitions. This is a removal of that cultural land use that connected people to these lands. There's some wonderful research out of the Chippewa National Forest where they're looking at the stand density of red pine. And what they find is that the denser the stands, the more susceptible they are to drought and drought impacts. And so linking to climate change, what has happened now is that with a transition and a loss of fire, cultural fire from these landscapes, the forests have now changed to become more susceptible to severe fires, while also becoming more susceptible to drought impacts, which in many models are predicted to become more frequent and potentially more intense. On that bigger picture, the idea that these sites that were used to literally justify the establishment of the Wilderness Acts and the Boundary Waters Canary Wilderness are actually products of people and their relationship with landforms and landscapes. But it's not just about wilderness. And I'll finish up with a slide. We've done a lot of work elsewhere, and I can talk more about that later. But there's a personal side of this. While we were doing this work, I spent a year on sabbatical. There's a cabin that my family has owned for 30 years. It's near Brainerd, Minnesota. Maple basswood, beautiful, rich forest, beautiful spot off of a bay on a small lake. The red pine that are over a story, super story above the maple. I've always appreciated them. In the fall, my kids had a 1.5 mile walk to the 1.5 hour bus ride into Brainerd for school. The winter, the lake froze, we could ski or snowshoe. But then in the spring, when this ice got soft, we started walking through the woods. And these places I'd been for 30 years, all of a sudden I see it differently. I see something like this and go around, and it's a red pine snag. And so we now have a fire history of Crooked Lake, where I've been going for all this time, and find out that there were fires almost every 10 to 15 years from 1804 to 1898 in the record we developed. And that 1898 is when a resort was put into place the next lake over. The red pine at this site are legacies of the relationships between people and land that were moderated by fire. And now we've become a part of that story, but are we carrying our responsibilities? Are we doing that well? Robin Kimmerer is speaking tomorrow, and she writes so eloquently using braiding sweetgrass to talk about how our conceptions of human relations with the physical environment and the natural world and all our relations are so often framed in a negative context from a Western perspective. But if done well, it can be positive and constructive. It can be reciprocal. By tending with fire, we create the habitat for blueberries. We create the open areas that we camp and enjoy and are drawn to through time, these persistent places. In exchange, the red pine can continue living in these places. Its babies have a place to land and grow. The last piece that I'll end with this is that, you know, I'm sharing these stories. These are stories from trees that have been living on these sites for hundreds of years. And what we've come to realize in that a lot of places, and Ron kind of alluded to this, but the people of these stories are missing a generation because of boarding schools, because of policies that have been bent on disappearing cultures. And so what we feel really honored with right now is that by taking these stories from the growth rings of trees, it's almost like we're spanning that gap and hopefully being able to help people remember the stories and re-engage with these places in ways that we haven't in a long time. And so, oh geez, I talked 14 minutes. I'm so sorry. A couple minutes over, I'll stop there. And hopefully we have time for questions afterwards. So thank you for sharing time with me.
Evan, thanks a lot. Not everyone has McKaylee waiting over their shoulder to keep them honest with time. That was fantastic. And we have a question in the Zoom chat that I'll ask you now. A participant wants to know if there's been a rebuttal to a recent article that appeared in Nature. You've probably seen it, Conservation Implications of Limited Native American Impacts in Pre-Contact New England. I think I've seen a couple articles along these lines where folks have said, no, there wasn't actually that much fire in New England in particular.
That's a great question. And I gave you the super abbreviated version of this talk, and it's constantly evolving. We've got a paper that's just coming out in Ecosphere that directly addresses this, but there were a whole series of responses. In particular, Dr. Christopher Ruse, Texas Methodist, I believe, has some really pretty amazing work that kind of directly addresses some of these points. The amazing thing is the timing of these conversations, because this paper is coming out at the same time that there's this immense recognition and realization of the importance of cultural fire in the Western United States. And I feel like this East-West tension, it's a function of differences in place. And I would argue that in the Eastern United States, where conditions are wetter than out West, and that fire and its effects aren't quite as obvious right at the outset, that cultural fire was even more important here in creating the patterns that we see on the landscape. So yes, there are some wonderful responses. I can post a couple links in the chat of papers that have directly addressed that. And I'm happy to do that as we go through the next presentation.
Thanks, Evan. We'll come back to Evan and questions about fire scars and tree ring data and all that stuff when we have our big Q&A session at the end. So thanks a lot. Now, I think let's go to Rachel. Rachel, I see you on camera. Are you able to share your screen and take the reins from Evan? All right, I'm seeing your screen.
Hi, yep. You can, oops, sorry guys. You can see that now?
Yes, I can, and I can hear you fine.
Okay. Oh darn, I don't know if I can advance through my slides though. Okay, I think I can do it. Sorry, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rachel McDonald. I'm the forester at Keweenaw Bay Indian Community. My talk today is basically how we at Keweenaw Bay Indian Community are starting to plan for climate change, how we plan to help make our forests and ourselves more resilient, and how we're using fire to do that as one tool. So to start, here we are. KBIC is what Keweenaw Bay Indian Community is known as. The dark purple is the whole 1842 ceded territory area. The salmon colored area is what KBIC people regard as the home territory, where settlements and where people, who now identify Ojibwe people of Lake Superior, who are members at KBIC, a lot of them came from this whole salmon colored area. And in the center there, in that kind of sea green color, that's the actual reservation. It's called the Lance Reservation. And it was established in place in 1854. What I mean is it was established around these treasured hunting and especially fishing grounds in the Keweenaw Bay there, where you can see the Keweenaw Peninsula jutting out into Lake Superior. KBIC Reservation and Lance Reservation was established around this popular fishing grounds and forest. And it was established because the native population, at the time, a lot of them lived there and migrated from the whole area to use the fishing area. The Ojibwe people also have a story for how they settled this place exactly around Lance Reservation. So it was recounted to me as the people came from the east and they were moving west. And in this place, they found very rich forests. And the forests were full of good medicines. And these people stayed and they're still here today. Uh-oh, maybe it's not advancing. Can you guys see the next one?
No, not yet. Can you try it again?
Sorry, guys. Hold on a second.
Rachel, do you see, is there an option that you can resume screen sharing? Looks like a little pause symbol at the top.
It says I'm still screen sharing. I just have to figure out why it's not advancing through the slides in that one. Okay. Well, I'm sorry about that, but I can still read you.
I can try to run the presentation from my computer, and you can tell me when
do that. Great.
Okay. We will reset here. 1 sec.
Thanks, Stephen. I'll start a little bit about the next slide. So climate change is coming to KBIC and the Lance Reservation, as it does everywhere, of course. I use Climate Wizard. It was a tool from the National Weather Service to make these maps. And actually, these maps are of historical change that has already occurred. Over the last about 60 years, how much have we witnessed the environment change, the climate change around us? And if you remember where the Lance Reservation was, just below that little thumb poking up into Lake Superior, it might not look like that much change is occurring, but the legend that I'll read for you is in units per year. So every year, the climate has been changed or has been observed to get warmer, especially in the middle of the winter months that the left-hand map shows you. And we also see that the climate each year is getting a little bit warmer. in our Lance Reservation area. So as a forester, I can plan for trees and for forests and make decisions that would be better adapted to warmer, drier soils. And in our neck of the woods, that means trees like red oak and white pine will be better adapted to handle these kind of climate change, changes that we're seeing. Could you go to the next one, please? Great. As land managers, we have some handy tools available to us, like the tribal adaptation menu on the left. And there's some Forest Service workshops and strategies that have been especially developed to build into to build in climate change into our planning and decision making. So I know that, red oak and white pine are likely to do better in 50 years. But how do I make that happen? How do we, as land managers and as communities, implement these changes? These guides are really helpful because they provide strategies, and especially the tribal adaptation menu. It's in a menu format, so they're meant to be used. And these were great starting points for us as we were starting to think about and work climate change into our decision making. So the next one, please. So oak, that picture on the left is a picture of oak forest and a low intensity burn going through the understory there. Oak is critically important at KBIC because it has excellent wildlife forage. So lots of animals eat acorns, deer, turkeys, squirrels, bear, and acorns are traditionally harvested as well. And we learn from our friends at the Forest Service who track oak in the whole eastern United States that oak is in decline. And they think it's largely because of fire suppression that we just heard about, or Indigenous peoples not setting recurring fires every 10 years that Evan and Ron spoke to. So we would like to restore oak at KBIC, and we started the process of planning this oak restoration by focusing on a strategy from the tribal menu, and that's called Gikinawabe. So Gikinawabe in Anishinaabe is the careful and respectful observation. So this is really, really noticing, gathering what information we have from the past and from elders, and also really taking on new eyes when we're on the ground, observing oak and the whole communities of plants that they live with. So we mapped out where oak currently is on the reservation and noticed that where we see these large mature oak, the next generation of oak seedlings and saplings are not competing very well. There's lots of other trees like maple choking out the oak. So we learned from Ron and other forest managers that oak used to thrive during a time when Indigenous people lit many low intensity fires. And our fire manager here at KBIC is initiating basically the whole fire program and bringing back and emphasizing a lot of that knowledge. And a lot of it is about repeated and low intensity fires that can be utilized on the landscape. Oak seedlings love sprouting back after a fire, and mature oak trees have thick bark that's resistant against the heat of low or moderate intensity fire. So it is adapted, to live with fire. We also noticed on the ground that we have some certain medicines. Other ones where oak is, blueberries can be common. And on certain sites, we have witch hazel as well. That's the plant on the top right, and its flowers. We know that blueberries love fire, but we're also paying a special attention to these other plants and seeing how they respond after fires and then after repeated fires. So if you could, next slide. So the next strategy that we focused on from the tribal adaptation menu is sustain fundamental ecological and cultural functions. We at KBIC have great cultural tools to restore oak. We have people and we have fire. We're already encouraging oak at this point. We've done some plantings. On the left, there's an oak and a fruit tree planting that we conducted, and it was in an area that was dominated by pine trees and had a fire pass through. So the openings, we'd like to get more plant diversity and feed people and wildlife with the fruit trees, and get the diversity with the oak as well. And on the right, there was a group of school kids that we had out on another oak planting. It was a Saturday morning in January, and it was 4 degrees outside, but all these kids packed up and they were there. It was pretty neat to be a part of. I don't know if you can see exactly, but there are little oak seedlings that are protected by deer protectors behind them. And in this situation, it was an aspen cut, so it's a young forest. And we noticed oak seedlings on this site, and we wanted to encourage them with more planting. Okay, next one. And another cultural function we have is getting more people in the woods again and involving people. This picture on the right is a picture of a chainsaw safety class. The area that we were doing it in had a lot of maple coming in that was choking out oak seedlings. So we provided a chainsaw safety class and hired 10 woods workers to basically cut the maple and promote that oak that is there. So these woods workers were producing, and the map on the left shows you, we just basically partitioned the area into 10 areas so that each person had their own area to work in. So each one of these woods workers were able to create firewood for themselves and other tribal families, and they had the opportunity to learn skills and work in the woods and have a job opportunity. So now we're hoping to implement fire as one of the next steps. But this was just an opportunity to give you a chance to see what's been done so far in our planning for fire and implementing that so that it can be effective and so that it can mean something to the community and caring for the woods. So I think that's it. Thank you very much, Stephen, for doing that with the presentation.
Sure, no problem. We have, we have more time than I expected. So we have maybe 25 minutes, maybe even longer for question and answer now. So let's give a quick round of applause or snaps if you prefer for our speakers. Thanks, Ron, Rachel, and Evan. And please, let's open it up for questions and discussion now. I'm going to be looking at the Passable chat window as well as our Zoom chat window. So please don't be shy. Let's hear what questions and ideas you have to share. Or you can unmute yourself and speak directly.
Oh, I can go. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. It was excellent to hear all of your work, and it's inspiring as well. It seems like there still might be barriers to doing this work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, implementing fire across the landscape as a way to not only manage our forests, but become more resilient to climate change.
That's great. Can we get each of you to weigh in on a couple of barriers that you see? Ron, we'll start with you.
Sure, it is a barrier considering I guess, getting the cultural significance of fire importance in line with the importance of the current use of timber and the forest products, part of the sawmill and the pulp mills. But as those markets begin to fluctuate and change, we've been talking to our ag department. We actually have an ag department now here, and talking about more opportunities for traditional forest products. So there are barriers, but I'm starting to see that there could be some potential as we move forward. So good question.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Sorry, go ahead, Evan.
Go for it.
I'll quick mention a couple. Here at KVIC, we have the challenge that the tribe owns or manages about a third of the reservation land area. So it's really a patchwork of what we can manage. But we're reaching out to our other large landowners in the area, like the industrial ones and other timber companies and other public land holdings. And then with the thought that the more communication that we can do and the more collaboration and outreach, then people will have a good idea of what's going on and why, and we can, set a high standard for land stewardship on the reservation.
So I'll chime in here too, and I'm in Platteville, Wisconsin, and not a lot of people have been to Platteville, but if you have, it's rolling hills and streams, and also a lot of corn and soy around here. And just outside of town, there's a big Smokey Bear sign. And I see that, and I think there's nothing to burn. So I feel, we're still at this still a time where we have this immense cultural baggage at a societal scale that we don't even know we carry. And I feel like every time that you see fire on the land in a good way, it changes that. And so just this spring, one time I drove to Madison, which is an hour drive, and I probably saw 30 pillars of smoke because it was the right day. And we just burned 4 prairies on campus. Some of them never been burned in the history of our university. And we had a whole bunch of students in there, setting fire. I'm working with our city council here to get a permitting process so we can burn our rain gardens, And I feel like all of these little steps shift that such cultural perspective, which then starts recognizing that it is such a rich process, but it's really hard and it's a slow process. We got a lot of prairies down here, and those people get it now. People burn prairies. Burning a forest is this whole other thing. And I feel like the conversation's right here. This is just, we're at this moment, and you hear it in the news, you see it all of a sudden it was this year they started interviewing elders out west. And I don't know if anybody else knows that. You're always hearing about California's on fire, but it was this year where all of a sudden they're talking with people. And that was a huge shift. And the moment we're in right now as a society, where all of a sudden it's we're coping with all this stuff that we've been hiding from for all this time. I feel like this is a moment where we can have some of these conversations accelerate really fast, because all of a sudden you connect it. It's not just fire. It's justice. It's tradition. It's connections to ancestral ways of doing things. And so there's immense leverage right now. And so this is a time to really push these conversations. That's what I think.
We got a question that kind of maybe pinballs off of that one a little bit, especially given the California reference. We heard a lot about climate change accelerating those fires out west, and we've been hearing that for a while. Do the three of you see evidence of how climate change has started to influence fire regimes in the Midwest?
We did. Well, I just did take some notes. So we burned, so middle of April for us, we burned 850 acres already on the forest. 5 burns in March, which is rare for us, has been rare. And we've burned 10 out of the 19 days in April on the forest. So if it's a fire day, if it's a good day, we got fire on the ground. That takes a lot of planning, having everything ready, having the personnel to do it, having the leadership to do it. And when you look at the weather the next day and it's a burn day, we're out there putting it on the ground, and that's key. So for us, I believe, this spring is a real indication. A lot light snowfall in the winter, burning in the middle of March, having a larger window to burn and taking advantage of it. So for us, as far as a fire regime, I'll just pass on that one. I'll keep going. If I keep talking, I'll talk about it for quite a while. I'll just pass on to Evan.
At KVIC, we've seen other disturbances that are likely, really intense ones lately that seem to be from climate change, like intense windstorms, intense floods. So that can really cause an accumulation of fuels on the ground, or stuff that, dead trees piled up where they wouldn't normally be. That creates a lot of fire hazards for us. So yeah, we're waiting. Hopefully they won't be, bad fires. We don't typically have them up here in our neck of the woods, a bad fire season. But still, where you have people and where you have piles of fuel on the ground, it's a danger and a hazard for sure.
Stephen, you can direct me, because I was reading some of the questions and I didn't hear exactly what you prompted us, but I like what Ron and Rachel said, so I can go off of them, or if you want to bring me back.
We were asked specifically about climate change. Do you see any evidence of how climate change has already changed the fire regime in the Midwest?
It's interesting with the records that we've developed in the Great Lakes region. There's a really strong relationship between drought and fire, and that. That's when we run the analysis and we find that, we're kind of like, oh, wow, what a great finding. It's one of those questions like, well, of course. And so, it's really interesting to think about, how drought patterns are changing, more precipitation, but more intense and potentially enhanced drying outside of those windows. So you could see an increase in fire risk, but we also, in just the records, like the 1860s, it was so dry and it burned everywhere. 1730s, there was fire everywhere. And so regardless of the direction that precipitation goes in the Great Lakes, we're also simply dealing with the fact that there will be years that fires will burn, and that will be driven by climate. And so all these steps, that you hear about out west, but also increasingly here fire-wise, creating force structure through fire that is resilient to fire. That's kind of one of these things we should be doing anyway. And I think the compounded risk of climate change just makes that even more important.
So Evan, you just to capture something you said there, fire helps forests become resilient to fire. And we have a question that's kind of along those lines, but specific to drought. Molly asks, are there other ways that we can be helping forests become resilient to drought Is fire one of those tools? Is it the only tool? Are there other things we could be doing to help fire or forests become more resilient to drought in particular? Rachel, we'll start with you for this one. We'll break up the order a little bit.
Well, I'm a forester, so of course you can harvest trees. When you make a forest less dense, then those remaining trees will be stronger, they'll be healthier. You know, foresters can help you identify, and that's how we practice forestry at KDIC. We're leaving the best trees, you know, for the next generations. They have to be the strongest, they have to have the best genes, they have to be the most, you know, resilient, basically. They have to be the healthiest ones. So definitely you can thin out forests so that they're not all those trees are competing for the same resources. That's a real stressor.
Ron, is there anything you'd add to that about helping forests cope with the drought?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to it. You know, looking at our east side of I kind of showed some of the slides about how our forest has become less fire prone due to the fire suppression in mid-tolerant species growing in underneath our pine oak stands that were traditionally open. And we're getting back in, especially in the southeast corner where there's a lot of pin oak and there's a lot of a pine mixed in. You know, we're looking at that landscape and removing the red maple and the pin oak, opening it back up, putting fire back on. We're getting prairie grasses back in. So, you know, how much of that do the tribal members want for gathering opportunities? That type of landscape. You know, we talked about the Carner Blue. So we're looking at that. So we're taking it from the fire suppression standpoint, we're making it less fire prone to more fire prone, but we like it. You know, if we burn it, if we open it up and like Rachel talked about, you know, opening it up and thinning a little bit and using fire as a tool, I think that's one way we can help.
I'll chime in on that too, because the work Brian Pollack and a bunch of his colleagues have been involved in this. You know, if I recall correctly, there's good evidence that if you do have a stand that's really dense and you thin it out, you know, there's, like Rachel said, fewer trees competing for the same amount of resource, and so that can have a really big impact. I feel like this goes back to that fundamental framing of our relationship with the land too, because it's not like you just thin it once and then you're good. And I feel like in so many of the conversations that we're having right now, and Dan Wildcat mentioned this in the keynote this morning, is like we are at this point now where we are on the verge of some really hard work, because we just went 100 or more years in a lot of places without a fire, in places that used to have a fire every 5 to 10 years. And you see this out west with thinning. I feel like we've been insulated from this conversation because it's not quite as obvious in the Great Lakes region, but it's still happening and it's still here. And so that work if you want to get fire back in, how do you get there? Because either you have earthworms eating the fuels, or it's so shady that you don't have any fine fuels to carry the fire. You know, how do you first thin? How do you do that safely for all the trees and that broader community of life that's there? And then once it's thinned, how do you maintain that structure? And so that's the point that we're at in so many places, like that hump you got to get over. And after you get there, it gets easier and easier. But we are looking at a lot of work. And I feel like, if anything, what we should really come to agreement is like, it's going to be hard. So that's where we're at. I feel like we've put ourselves in that position.
I guess that kind of maybe is a nice segue to a good question that Melanie asked. Melanie asked if, I guess to paraphrase, we know we've got to use more fire. Are there ways we can decolonize fire and return the cultural use of fire here in our region? Some of you are practicing this. Do you have thoughts on how we can do more cultural use of fire or decolonizing fire?
I guess I'll start. I think it starts with I guess surprisingly, we talked about the oral history. We talked about the gap. Evan talked about the gap. You know, bridging that gap and doing outreach and getting out to our younger generation, using the elders and their traditional knowledge in bridging that gap, because there's definitely a gap there of how much fire was actually, how important it was culturally, and how much of it was actually on the forest here. So for us to be able to use it and to put it much fire on the ground as we want to, we're going to have to go back and actually teach again and spread the message of the very beneficial use of fire, natural use of fire, and cultural use of fire. So we're going to start, and we've been doing that for the past few years. So I think outreach is a very important part of it.
Yeah, I'd echo what Ron said, with maybe a little different bent. You know, working with our partners is pretty darn important. Like Lance Reservation can be kind of small and constrained, not have that many good areas for burning in. But just off the reservation, we have some great, you know, blueberry lands on the Forest Service, and you know, they're asking our fire manager, Tom Chosa, you know, to come down and to help and provide what he knows, and you know, to gather up crews and resources. So by reaching out to, you know, your DNR, to your neighbors who might complain, you know, if there's smoke or anything, telling them what you're doing ahead of time and saying, hey, you know, we have some resources, we can help you out, and then let us help you out when you're doing your work too. I think that's happening a lot in the fire world. You know, there's only so many engines in our neck of the woods, and if we can collaborate and work together and prescribe burns and then suppression, it just works better that way.
For what it's worth, just to add on to what Rachel said there, I got to experience that a little bit last week. I was in a meeting with the Ottawa National Forest talking about, you know, a project plan that is kind of bumping up next to the KBIC reservation. And that was a big part of what they're talking about, is how to do burns that will support and enhance tribal values like blueberries in this big area, which, I mean, think about the Forest Service having serious discussions about blueberries. That's a sign of progress.
I want to call out Ron on this one, because I feel like you just told us what you're doing. You got a bunch of foresters, or you know, whoever, like their job, they're just supposed to do the inventory. They're supposed to hear, no, it's a good day to burn, so we're going to burn. Like that right there is huge, I think, because it's recognizing, you know, you're letting go of some of the control of like what the schedule says you should be doing at whatever time, and you're starting to burn when it's the right time to burn. And I feel like I see a couple of my students from a fire ecology class I'm teaching this semester here, and like their schedules have been just completely shot this spring, because we're like, oh, it's time to burn. Like you have to miss all your other classes. Let's go out. And I feel like that stepping and letting go of the control that supposedly we're supposed to carry in our work and our lives, I feel like that action is something that we all have a lot of control over, to engage in a very personal way of decolonizing our relationship with fire and a lot of things. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're doing it, Ron, and that's awesome.
I guess just following on that a little bit, I'm going to skip to Aubrey had a question about, you know, we're thinking about climate change is moving suitable burn windows. Ron mentioned you've been burning already in March and most of the days of April, it sounds like. What do we know about the response of vegetation to fires in different times of the year? For example, is a March or April prescribed burn going to be as beneficial for blueberries as an August burn? It's a good question. Does anyone have input on that?
We've been monitoring. We've done, again, even if it's, you know, we've done spring, summer. We've done some summer burning just for that reason, just to monitor and see. Some of the elders that we talked to remember being taken back out to areas to gather. They would go and look in the spring, like now they would, their father would take them around and look at the burn scars, wherever they'd be in the southeast, and then they would come back there in the summer to gather. She remembered, through talking to some of them. So we do summer, even fall, to monitor. The monitoring data we have, we probably don't have enough areas to do it and burn and to get a real good answer out of it. But we've been moving our burns. If we get a burn window in the summer, we'll take it, and we'll, depending on if it's a site prep. So we have different types. We have site prep for forest management. If there's a good cone crop, we had a good July burn when the pine cone was still hanging on. There's a good cone crop up there, we noticed. So we tried to burn understory burn, and we had really good response and seed. So we do different seasonal burns and monitor. We don't have that much prairie grass, but we do. We're monitoring closer now to check that out.
Evan or Rachel, do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have kind of personal insight, but I will throw out their conversation with the folks up at Grand Portage. I know they've been burning for blueberries. And I'm pretty sure they're spanning different seasons, and they've got some pretty good data in terms of response of the plants, both kind of immediately as well as over the next number of years. And so they might be somebody to reach out with insights to this.
Aubrey, I can help put you in touch with those folks if you have questions. Rachel?
Oh, I have a little bit of experience burning blueberries in state lands, and those were spring burns. Approximately every 3 years, they say, yields a pretty good crop. But I know people are more interested in that, the different seasonality and what that does for blueberries. And I can't speak more, sorry.
Well, the Passable website is starting to flash at me, and that means my responsibility as a moderator is to bring this gracefully to a close. This was fascinating. I think we could have talked for another hour easily about this. And gosh, this was only with 3 of our 4 speakers. Imagine if we had Tommy in here too, bringing the North Carolina perspective. Let's give a big virtual round of applause for Evan, Rachel, and Juan. Thank you, Ron. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and experience and enthusiasm for this subject. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the week. We have a great lineup of other seminars and speakers at Shifting Seasons, so please stick around and catch some of the other stuff that is on display here. Bye, everyone.
Well navigated, Stephen. That was good.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I was going to ask maybe just a little inside baseball. I had a conversation with, oh shoot, I'm blanking on his name now, Wisconsin DNR fire guy.
Jed Menominee.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess what caught my attention is on that, you had that figure with the gray clouds and then the red dots kind of showing the pulses. And
yep.
And there's a lot to observe there. And you had a couple lines where there were, fires everywhere.
Yeah.
That seemed like something Jed really emphasizes. You have these years where the landscape burns.
Yeah.
And so there's this balance between the climate conditions say, okay, everywhere's going to burn versus, these intermediate years where the people are burning. I don't know. I just wonder if that is a tension, or is that like just recognizing that both things can happen at the plate?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so I know Jed, we did a fire history site outside of Black River Falls, like his first couple months back in Wisconsin after finished PhD, and we got some active collaborations. We have differing opinions on some things, and we still work together. So it's a great coming together. He is all about the climate driven mega fires, right? And those are totally real. You know, there are years where it's crazy dry and it just burns. One of the really interesting things that we see in the boundary waters is that, you know, Bud Heinzelman does this great landscape scale fire history back in the 60s and 70s. And that's kind of like what everybody just thinks of up there. And we've got a lot of those years where we had fire scars all through. Those were the same years that Heinzelman would have like huge landscape scale fires. And so what's really cool is that those data are telling us that, like, yeah, a whole bunch of stuff burned to the ground, but you also had a surface fire component, which is interesting. And this is a tough spot with what Jed's talking about. Is like, if you have fire scars, that means it wasn't a stand replacing fire. And so that means that it wasn't like this necessarily everywhere catastrophic huge burn. It means that conditions were really good to burn that year. And one of the things we really struggled with in our data set is like, okay, well, which are the human set fires and which are the ones that were set or caused by lightning? Or what's the role of drought? And it's really important to realize, like, just because it's drought doesn't mean that people aren't setting fires. In fact, it means that it's easier for humans to have caused some of these ignitions. And so right now we're collaborating with Jed and some folks from Mizzou and like Mike Stambaugh and Rich Guyette. Or not Rich, sorry, and a whole bunch of other people to bring together like all of our data from the Great Lakes so we can start laying out and kind of seeing that scale. And it's going to be super cool. It's a great collaboration. But yeah, so climate's definitely important and people are really important. And there's a figure in the paper that's hopefully it's in press, they've accepted it. Like we're waiting to see the proofs of this one for Ecosphere where like we were struggling with this because we were using standard techniques to look at the climate response. And then we were looking at spatial differences and we were trying to disentangle these. And this kind of like crazy conceptual diagram, like pulling graphs and stuff like that came together. And it was the first time to my eye that I really like understood the human component. And I don't know, I can show it to you, which would be useful to me to see it again if you want to, or I can just say like, yeah, it's definitely both. And I think the important part is to realize that like, just because it's dry doesn't mean people weren't setting fires. What we find in the boundary waters, the really distinct period are the number of fires that occurred during the not dry years. And those to us are really that human signature. And so it's like you have this broader burn window as well as just more fires overall. So, yeah.
Huh. Well, that's really interesting to hear that. Well, number one, that there's this bigger round table of data coming together. That's going to be fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining this discussion. You added a lot.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm super glad to have been here. So thanks for organizing.
To be continued.
All right. I'll see you around the conference.